A just war, whether or not the Israeli-Gaza conflict and whether Israel's response is just, is, I think, a reasonable question, and one I've been going through in my mind all day, really. And some people would say that a just war, the two key principles are, is the cause just and is it the last resort? But in fact, if you start looking through the literature, it's not at all as simple as that. The biggest issue for Thomas Aquinas is whether or not the right authority is proclaiming that war, and also about the disposition of the people involved in the war. So Aquinas would say it's about proper authority, which would involve proportionality, having a just cause, which would involve, in this particular case, self-defense, the moral purpose of responding to an injury, a demonstrable injury, that's perfectly okay, and having the right intent. So that again comes down to the attitude of the combatants. There's a question about whether or not the war is necessary, and the word necessary is often thrown out in philosophical discussions. It always sounds very grand, but necessary is, if something is necessary, can you imagine it not existing? It's an ambiguous term. Well, I can imagine the war in Gaza not existing. And can I imagine anything else? Yes. So it's not necessary. It might be prudent, it might be advantageous. Some people might even argue that it's efficacious. I don't think so, and that's where it falls down. I think the siege of Gaza is already destructive and destroys Israel's moral advantage. Now, this may be because Israel has been provoked into doing something evil. Hamas is cruel and cynical, using human shields, both Palestinians and Israeli hostages, and then when faced with a barrage of Israeli arms, missiles, Israel cannot dismiss these people as simply collateral damage or as the responsibility of Hamas, because it says all the time that it goes out of the way to minimize casualties among non-combatants. Well, Hamas is making sure that that isn't the case. Now, in this particular case, in the case of the siege, Israel is already assuming that that isn't the case. And that changes the nature of the debate significantly. So, is this a just war? Can we go through the sort of checklist of what is necessary to have a just war? It's like a laundry list of options. And the just war falls into two parts. The whether something is just in going into the war, the jus ad bellum, and whether the war itself is conducted with justice, jus in bello. But both of these are connected together by the desire to establish the goods and the harms of war itself. It's a framework for the waging of war. And so if we start with the first in the laundry list, which is competent authority, in what way is Israel the competent authority? Well, the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, who I don't like, Netanyahu has authority over Israel politically as the elected Prime Minister. He also has authority to protect the Israeli people. In fact, I would say that's an authority that every trained Israeli soldier has. And we saw it rather brilliantly. We see it quite brilliantly in interviews with people who immediately responded to protect their loved ones and to protect the Israeli people from the Hamas terrorist event last Saturday. That is the authority of Israel as a concept. And is that located solely in the Prime Minister? No, it's spread across the people. Now, there's a third sense of authority, and that is the authority that Israel has assumed over Gaza, that allows, therefore, for the siege and the invasion, insofar as it's not an invasion of another country. It's rather like a teacher who might impose a detention on a class, and I think this is possibly a misinterpretation of authority, but it's the only authority that I can find that would allow for such an immediate declaration of war, such an immediate... Sorry, I was interrupted by an alarm clock. I think the authority of Israel over Gaza, as understood as the authority of a sort of minder, the authority of a teacher, is the only reasonable explanation to justify the threatened ground attack, to justify the siege. The second principle in the laundry list would be the probability of success, and I don't think that is there at all. I think it's wishful thinking, because the probability of success is reduced by the fact that there is a large urban population of civilians. A last resort, that isn't happening at all. We aren't looking at a last resort. We're looking at a first impulse. And a just cause. Well, I think that I think is reasonable. The just cause is a response to a huge terrorist attack. So in those in those four principles, does Israel have authority, or does the Prime Minister have authority? Yes and no. Is there a probability of success? No. Is it a last resort? No. Is it a just cause? No. Yes. So, in fact, of those four principles for going into war, it seems finely balanced between an acceptable option and an unacceptable option. So, 2-2. The justice in war, jus in bello, starts with the idea of distinction. The just war should be governed by distinction. The acts of war should be directed towards enemy combatants and not towards non-combatants. And so there again, if the war has already begun, which I think it has, the people who are suffering are largely non-combatants on both sides. So on both sides, this is not a just war. Proportionality? No, because Israel is significantly better armed than Hamas. But this is a guerrilla war, and the guerrillas have the advantage. Military necessity, the idea of necessity. Now, we looked at necessity earlier, and I think the word necessity here can often be misunderstood, that it's necessary to defeat the enemy. Yeah, that's an understanding of the word necessary. But necessary in philosophical senses is always about, can you imagine anything else? If you can, it's not necessary. And I can, I'm afraid. So it fails there. The fair treatment of prisoners of war. Well, I think, actually, the prisoners of war in Israel are treated fairly. I think the prisoners of war in Gaza are probably not being treated fairly. But so we could perhaps waive that one for the moment. And malum in se, that we should not be using evil weapons. Evil weapons for the medieval would be rape, would be forcing enemy combatants to fight against their own side, would be using weapons that cannot be controlled, like biological weapons or nuclear weapons. So, both in the jus ad bellum and in the jus in bello, I think it's a razor's edge about whether Israel has the right or the right mindset to conduct a war at the moment. And therefore, I think they shouldn't. Therefore, I think they should be waiting. And I think there should be negotiations. But then the question is, who does Israel negotiate with? With whom do those negotiations take place? Because Hamas isn't going to negotiate. So that's a much bigger question. And overriding the whole thing is the question of the return of the hostages. And if we go back, as I did yesterday, to rabbinic approaches to this, the taking of hostages automatically incurs war. And that's a reference to the book of Numbers.